How do you do? My name is Patrick Carey. I'm the architecture editor for Greenroofs.com. This is the second of two panels that we're having for the virtual conference on phytoremediation. The first panel had Dr. Clayton Rue, Dr. Paul Mankiewicz, and Dr. Alan Darlington talking about applications of green roof technology for and living wall technology for primarily air phytoremediation and for some wastewater developed by land water waste. And what we're going to be talking about today we have Ian Balcom, who's a associate professor at Lyndon State College. He received his PhD from University of California, Riverside in environment from the environmental toxicology program. The topic of his thesis was on the research on microbial ecology of plant root surfaces in polluted soils. Ian doesn't have a strong background in green roofs and living walls per se, but his depth of understanding of the processes of soil ecology and specifically microbial activity within the soil with regard to phytoremediation is pretty deep. I first ran into him at a phytoremediation conference in Oregon, and I believe the first 4 slides of his presentation were all molecular diagrams, so completely over my head. So I'm very privileged to have him with us. He's also been interested in working with doing research on multifunctional landscape systems, which we might talk about today in conjunction with what's going on top of and alongside the building. Things that might enhance the total phytoremediation effect of the built environment and its immediate environments and immediate surroundings. Okay, and then the other fellow on the panel is Bob Cameron. I ran into Bob at a number of green roof conferences. Bob's at Penn State. He's been doing a bunch of research on gray water phytoremediation using green roofs and living walls as a mechanism of biofiltration. He's published a number of papers and presented a number of papers on biofiltration, phytoremediation using green roofs and living walls, as well as participated in some thermal studies too with regard to green roofs and living walls. The strength that I think Bob brings to the panel is that Penn State has a particularly well-developed green roof program, both in terms of research and experimentation, and working with people like Bob Burgage, David Beatty, who were also David Beatty was deeply involved in developing green roofs as a viable building element that heals the environment. For those of you who don't have a familiarity with phytoremediation, I'd like to give a sort of a brief introduction to it. Phytoremediation is basically having the use of plants to clean things up, to remediate or to remedy problems in air, water, or soil. It's been plants and their immediate environments of the plants, the rhizosphere or the root area of the plants, is a very chemically complex biosystem of fungi, bacteria, plant enzymes, plant hormones, various chemical compounds that act on pollutants in a way that can clean them up in a number of different ways that we'll go into in more depth later. But that's basically what phytoremediation is in a very gross general application. And by the introduction of green roofs, living walls, bioswales, using different kinds of wetland ecologies is a way that we're looking at introducing more and more phytoremediation characteristics to the built environment, as well as introducing constructed landscapes to perform the same thing in places like brownfields or polluted ground sites. It's happening now. So without further ado, I introduce myself, Patrick Carey. My background is, my academic background is basically architecture and philosophy, and for the last probably 15 years, 12 years, I've been involved with green roof research, experimentation, design, installation, and basically trying to catch up with people that know more than I do about any particular topic related to green roofs or living walls. So let me see, beyond that, I'd like to cut to the chase here and introduce Ian Balcom. Let's see, Ian, let me see, I was wondering, because you have probably the deepest understanding of the phytoremediation process from the soil biology level. If you could go into some of the processes and mechanisms by which phytoremediation occurs, and
Okay.
take it away.
Yeah. Well, this may have been brought up in the last panel, but when you're looking at using plants to clean up contaminants, a good place to start with is what class of contaminants you're dealing with, because they're not all created equal, so to speak, and specifically whether or not it's an organic compound, if it's a hydrocarbon, or if it's a metal. You have to think about them as two completely different ball of wax. And the nutshell there is that with metals like lead, mercury, cadmium, zinc, nickel, things like that, they're elements, so they can't be broken down. The best you can do is move them around from one place to another. It's just kind of a shuffling trick there that you can do in some cases with plants, but it's looking more and more like that's relatively difficult to do. I don't know if you'd agree with that, Bob, but it seems like that's availability can be challenging there. And so with inorganics like metals, it seems to be looking like more and more the best scenario is to keep them in place and limit their movement through the environment, if that's if you're still looking at using plants. And so there's a class of a category of phytotechnologies or plant approaches that's termed Phyto Stabilization. That seems to be a really successful way to deal with metal contaminated soils and other types of media, where you just put a green cap, a living cap, over the top of a contaminated environment and keep it stabilized so it doesn't erode or move through the environment in other ways. So metals can be challenging, but typically I think I'm trying to make connections as I go with the architectural integration and green roofs and walls, but it seems to me that typically, unless you're looking at remediating a site before you build, which is a good thing to do, to pick an old brownfield to build on. With green roofs, you may not be dealing with as much metals as you would as dealing with organics. And so organic compounds, anything containing carbon, are much more amenable to phytotechnologies. And there's a whole bunch of different sub-technologies within phytotechnologies that deal with organics. But just if we were to put them all together, the basic goal there is to destroy the contaminant, to literally break it down in place through primarily mechanisms that plant-associated microbes can do for you. And so these can happen on leaf surfaces, they can happen along the root surfaces, they can happen in soils around roots, they can even happen inside of plants with endophytic organisms. And so if we were to look more, talk more specifically about the different types of approaches there, the type of contaminant would help direct what approach you use. There are classes of compounds called volatile organic compounds that are volatile at room temperature or in atmospheric pressure, and those can be dealt with in using plants in a variety of ways. But there's been some research done for years now. I think that it sounds like Bob, you were involved with NASA at some point, but they did work early on looking at houseplants, removing volatile organic compounds from indoor air, and shown that there was variable success in the type of houseplant that you use, but nevertheless they are successful. And so the plants would actually absorb some of those compounds and bring them in, and whether it's the enzymes within the plants themselves breaking them down or microbes associated with the plants, they might break it down. So that's an approach. Let's see what else. I mean, particulate matter is definitely an area that could be addressed with roofs and walls. The trichomes, all the little hairs on leaf surfaces, are very good at grabbing particulate matter, and that's been observed for many years. Actually, the first article that I came across on that subject was published in 1898. The commissioner of parks for New York City was examining a relationship between density of London plantain trees and public health, and showed that it was a very clear relationship there. And so that's been known for quite some time. And it was probably from coal soot particles being removed from the air by the plants. And so in some cases there are microbes involved there, but typically that's a physical process where the particulate matter would land on the leaf surface, and then at least in the outside environment, it gets rained out, it gets washed off, and then it falls into the soil environment where it could be broken down further. But it's primarily a physical mechanism that plants help usher those compounds, those particles onto their surfaces, and then it can be removed from the air. Let's see what else. Well, just some terms. There's this area is just chock full of terms, and phytotechnologies in general. There are many overlapping terms that can be encountered, but it's at some point it's almost meaningless. I mean, they're also redundant, but I think some that you'll encounter are phytotransformation, Phyto Stabilization, Phyto Extraction, and I can describe these in more detail, and Volatile Ization. So phytotransformation is phyto meaning plant, and taking a compound and transforming it from a toxic compound to a less toxic compound, or from a stable compound to a less stable compound, or more easily broken down compound, or breaking it down from a very persistent molecule to something that's less persistent in the environment. So that's just literally transforming the molecule from one compound to another. And this is a mechanism that's, again, primarily done by plant-associated microbes and less so by plants. That's something that's a recurring theme here. In terms of Phyto Stabilization, I described that a little bit earlier, but that's using plants as a cap for contaminated materials. Or stabilizing, eroding environments. There's a lot of work done for many years. Rufus Cheney at USDA has done work with this at mine tailings and smelter plumes and things like that, where they would go in and just by changing the soil environment, adding organic matter and some other lime or something like that, they would allow plants to grow and then stabilize the material. Phyto Extraction. This was, for many years it seemed to be one of the main goals of phytoremediation was to be able to remove metals from the soil environment. And there's been a lot of work done on that, but it seems to have been met by very limited success because of the time issues. It takes many years to extract lead from soil, for example, and so it's very difficult to do as a result. Another term that you'll see is Raizo Filtration. This is using roots to filter water, typically, and the constructed wetlands environment scenarios are a good example of that, where roots, just either a high surface area, and the fact that they attract many microbes, are very effective filters. And so you could actually filter, metals, you could filter organics, you could filter a variety of different things. And there's been a lot of work done there, many applications that I think Bob could probably speak better about. Phytovolatilization is another term. So volatilizing means just taking something that's stable at room temperature or standard atmospheric temperature and pressure, and then making it volatile, either physically doing that or changing the chemistry. Typically with plants, at least with organics, they would act as a pump. So there's been a lot of applications using willow trees and more specifically poplar trees to suck out contaminated groundwater and pull volatile compounds out of groundwater up into the atmosphere, into the lower atmosphere, where they can be destroyed by sunlight. So that's another term you'll see. Let's see, any others that you guys have encountered? There's a ton of them out there.
I've heard of some that have to do with sequestration, things like hyperaccumulation, sequestration, things that seem to be related to storage within the plant tissues until the plant becomes saturated with the product, and then it's harvested in some way, usually incinerated to concentrate the waste that's been accumulated in the plant tissues. That's the stuff that I've heard about. Bob?
Yeah. And the Brassicaceae, so there's certain groups of plants too that seem to be particularly good at uptaking various types of materials. So you look at Brussels sprouts, cauliflower, cabbage, that whole group seem to have a lot of potential for uptaking some materials. And as Ian alluded, NASA at one point actually looked at taking plants and using them in a constructed wetland setting to uptake metals from their laboratories, and then they would compost those plants to be able to recoup the metals back. Again, not a very efficient operation at this point, but we are, as we look at some of these plants, trying to find better plants that are more hyper-accumulating.
Alan Darlington in Toronto, who's one of the participants in the previous panel, is the founder of a company called Nedlaw, and their technology rests on the shoulders of some of that NASA research. The whole idea there is to draw in indoor air into the rhizosphere of certain species of plants that will target certain indoor air pollutants like formaldehyde, volatile organic compounds. They could do toluene, but toluene is not a common interior air pollutant, but benzene sometimes is. So there are particular plants that will, like you say, Bob, target certain pollutants, and they're discovering more every day. They're discovering more plants that either have a broader appetite in terms of pollutants that they can deal with, or new plant species that haven't been investigated that can also add to the bioremediation effect, the phytoremediation effect. I had a question, Ian. Have you ever, do you know of a process or ever heard of a process where an element is neutralized by combining it or binding it with other molecules in a phytoremediation or in a, I don't know what, a microbial biochemical context?
Yeah, there are scenarios that they would, I guess you could call them phytoreduction or phytooxidation, where you'd either reduce or oxidize an element, and that just is a way of, it's a chemistry term, but it's a way of saying that you've moved electrons around, so something's served as an electron donor and something's an acceptor, and this is one way that chlorinated solvents are dealt with in groundwater, is by adding something that like something as innocuous as vegetable oil to actually interact with that compound. The plants can do that. I think there have been some work with selenium and arsenic in particular, so they would change it from selenate and selenite back and forth depending, and one would become, and the goal there is to make it insoluble in water. So rather than actually pulling it out of the soil into the plant, you are changing the interaction with water, and it's making it stable and therefore less bioavailable to us and to other animals, and less toxic as a result.
When you talk, what prompted me to ask that question was that when you described phytovolatilization, I know that you can take a particular pollutant molecule and disturb it a little bit, taking one of the atoms out of it, whether it's something the plant wants, like sulfur or nitrogen or whatever that it would use for its normal metabolic processes, and then creating a molecule, a resultant molecule that is less stable, so that when it's finally volatilized or let loose in the atmosphere, it's more vulnerable to being changed even further than it was previously.
That's true. Of aromatic compounds like polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, PAHs. They're very stable in their ring structure, and if you can cleave open that ring, then you can then start to break it down. They don't last nearly as long in the environment, and these compounds definitely would be encountered by green roofs and green walls because they're soot particles from diesel engines and from tire dust and from trains and things like that. So there's definitely very common in the environment. And with that particular class of compounds, and this is true of many of that kind, where they're these sort of large ring structures, and they don't like water, so they're called hydrophobic. They're very persistent. They last a long time in the environment if you don't attack them specifically. It really requires, from what I found, there's a kind of a trifecta of organisms that are recruited by plants to do this, because they're so hydrophobic that the plant can't get them. They're stuck on the soil particles, and so as plants transpire, they pull water up from their roots into their tissues and into their shoots, but these compounds are stuck in the soil environment. So it requires some sort of a microbe interaction at the root environment to make them more soluble. Things that produce biosurfactants and stuff like that. So they would solubilize it, and then there is typically a microbe in the soil environment that has the enzymatic capability to break open that ring structure. And then the other one is this sort of plant growth promoting relationship that seems to pull those three together in this sort of consortium where they all work cooperatively.
Yes. In industry, we often use coal metabolites, especially with wastewater treatment, when you were dealing with some specific chemicals in a wastewater that weren't routine, by augmenting with things, carbon sources, something as simple as sugar, adding that to it. We found that allowed the bacteria again to grow those bacterial films that we needed, and then to attack these compounds that were more resistant. So we also use this with subsurface investigations. But again, co-metabolites is a great way to address some of the more resistant compounds.
We've been starting to use sugars, things like blackstrap molasses solutions to enhance fungal and bacterial development in the soil in general, just to create a more stable and broadly based ecology. One of the things I found out when we were first doing some research on phytoremediation was the NASA studies. It was interesting when I think it was Wolverton came out with
Bill
the first,
Wolverton, right.
when he did the first analysis. They attributed the resultant phytoremediation to the plant tissues themselves, and in subsequent publications, I think about 3 or 4 years later, a publication came out saying, well, you have the right results, but the wrong rationale for what produced them. That actually there was a lot more effect going on in the rhizosphere, or the plant. Usually, what the rhizosphere is roughly defined as being about the area or the volume in the root zone that's about an inch away from the furthest root hair of a root. So in that area, you've got such a spicy gumbo of activity going on, both chemically and biologically, that it's far more effective in terms of dealing with a broader range of pollutants than simply plant metabolism. But all right, so I'd like to shift this now, because now we're on the verge of talking about particular kinds of applications. And Bob, you've done a lot of work on one of the things that first called my attention was a paper that you produced from Penn State on. You had I believe a laundry washer, a washing machine. You were taking gray water from a washing machine and pumping it out to I think at least one green roof that would then take the excess water and move it to a living wall, and then from there it would go into a sort of like a phyto trough, something like a constructed bioswale, as I recall. If you could discuss your process in that, I'd really love to find out about it, because this is we're getting back into a green roof, living wall, particular kinds of applications for phytoremediation. So take it away, Bob.
Okay. Well, take you back a little bit in time just to get a sense of how I arrived at those types of experiments. And I had spent several decades directing the environmental program of a multinational conglomerate. And one of the things we realized early on is that traditional wastewater treatment plants just were not sufficient. And at that time, this is in the mid-70s, I had heard about Bill Wolverton's work at NASA looking at rock reed filters and how he would use this as we ventured out into space, and initially with the space station. I thought this was a great idea, but let's bring it back down to Earth and apply it to some of our wastewater issues. So Bill and I got together and we designed the first constructed wetlands to treat wastewater from the natural gas industry. Built the first one in the early 80s, and I've supplied some slides just to show a historical standpoint of what these early constructed wetlands look like. One of the interesting things when we look at all these types of biofilters is we think of this as a modern invention, but in reality, I'm always amazed by the fact that the ancient civilizations from Babylonia to Egyptians, Aztecs, etc., all deployed biofilters for treating waste. So it's amazing to me that we are rediscovering some of these things with our modern applications. But we took that philosophy of using constructed wetlands to address our industrial waste. And what we found, they were extremely effective. We do have some issues. Again, that's why the whole sense of coal metabolites, looking at how to address some of the specific compounds became issues. But when constructed wetlands were extremely efficient at addressing biological oxygen demand and total suspended solids. The negative of a constructed wetlands is they have a very, very large footprint. And that is because of what we call the hydraulic retention time, which is when you look at a drop of contaminated water, how long does it take for that to go through the process before the pollutants are attenuated? And that determines your hydraulic retention time of a system. Well, as a result, the footprints of these systems are very large. So what I looked at Penn State then was how could we integrate various types of biofilters, constructed wetlands, living walls, green roofs, and would the sum be greater than its parts? And so that comes back, Patrick, to this specific research. And I looked at actually both black and gray waters. And we developed a system that integrated a constructed wetlands, a living wall, and a new system I called a living column. And this was in essence taking elementary chemistry and creating a similar to a chromatography, using a column to put in various types of substrates, medias, going back to some of the processes that Ian was talking about, so we could accent chemisorptions, do various things with changing the valence state of pollutants. And the upshot of this was we found a very effective system, much reduced footprint. And again, I've included some data regarding the BODs and surfactants from gray water. But what we found very amazing actually to us is that within 24 hours, we were meeting NPDES standards for discharge. And when you compare that to a standard constructed wetlands, typically we look at an 8 to 10 day hydraulic retention time. So this was amazing reduction. But what that allows us, which is even more exciting, is now by having a smaller footprint, we can incorporate these systems into functional architecture. And again, as you alluded, we also looked at with green roofs. But again, all of these biofilters are in essence doing the same things. It's a system where the plants are providing a framework by which the workhorse, which are the microbial communities, are able to then attenuate the pollutants. One of the issues that we did find is that with wastewater, gray water in specific, all gray water is not created equally. And so when you look at doing these studies, it's very important that people specify whether they're using a shower water, water from a washing machine, etc. Very different properties within them. And one of the other things, researchers for the most part have used a laboratory-derived gray water. We chose instead to actually use a Maytag washing machine. We wash dirty clothes. I did many loads of dirty clothes. And what that provided us was a real-world range of parameters from gray water. Our system at the Center for Green Roof Research allowed us to do replicates at numerous buildings, and we were able to mix successive loads of wash so that we could mix this and then do replicate studies so we had the same BOD loading rates. But again, what this demonstrates is that these systems are very effective at attenuating pollutants. The other thing that's important from an energy standpoint is we looked at, well, what would happen instead of running the system 24 hours a day? What if we rested the system? And you think in the natural environment, this often happens, especially with wetlands. They're not constantly inundated. And so instead of 24 hours, we ran the system for 4 one-hour periods per day. And the result was nearly the same, a slight reduction in efficiency, but an 83% reduction in the amount of energy it took to operate the system. So again, as we look at ways of converting wastewater into a water resource, here is a potential for reducing the energy load. Our studies then proceeded to look at decreasing the energy of the building's envelope. And so what we found is the net result, we operated a wastewater treatment system which actually resulted in a net production for energy. In essence, we reduced the total energy needs of the building.
Rob, did you ever run into the issue of weather? One of the big differences between doing experiments in the laboratory and doing field experiments is that you've got rain. Now, I'm in the Pacific Northwest where there's the Eskimos have 100 words for snow. We have 100 words for rain here. The idea is that if you have this retention time that you're concerned about, you have a, say, gray water that you're introducing to a green roof in a rainy environment, is that going to be a different kind of process than the same kind of system in, say, the arid Southwest?
Yes, and again, you can use this to your advantage in certain areas, and especially in urban areas. although, for instance, acid rain in the Northeast has reduced dramatically, there are still areas, especially local areas, where there are potential impacts in highly agricultural developed areas. You can have certain amounts of pollutants coming off. And so what you do is you design your system to reflect those. If you have, as in your area, very high levels of rainfall, you need to reflect that. It can be used for flushing. So again, it depends on the pollutants that you're looking at. There's a big difference, for instance, whether you're addressing nitrogen compounds versus phosphate compounds. Phosphates are particular and will attach to compounds, and so flushing with high levels of rainfall can produce a discharge that could be problematic. And so you have to look at those types of things. In gray water, boron is another one that can end up finding a sink in biofilters, and then high levels of a rainfall could flush it out. So these are, again, issues in the design. One of the other ones that we have to look at, speaking of specific chemicals, are an area for future research are the estrogen mimickers and pharmaceuticals. We know from research that our existing standard treatment plants, or POTWs, are not completely effective at eliminating these compounds. And so one of the areas of focus now that we're looking at is how can we, using biofilters, can we actually attenuate these materials? And surfactants, which are very common in detergent for washing machines, there are some studies that suggest that when these break down, they produce some phenols that may be estrogen mimickers. So again, this all plays a role in going back to the rainfall. We may find that we attenuate traditional pollutants, but we have to be careful then on what we're actually discharging from the outfalls.
The things we were thinking about, one of the fantasies I've got about gray water phytoremediation in a architectural environment is the dream of being able to take a particular volume of water and phytoremediating it enough through successive cycles to reuse it 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times before you release it into the environment. I was amazed to find out that there are no current standards for water quality for things like showers or for things like washing machines. We're still using potable water for those functions, even though well biofiltered green water, which is phytoremediated gray water, could do the same job. But apparently there's a nightmare of regulatory conflicts that go along with gray water use of any kind, whether it's the water departments, the health departments, the plumbing codes are all not quite on the same page with all that stuff.
I've included a slide on a living shower. It's somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but also to show that we could back the process up and address wastewater at the source. But a valid concern, and this is one of the things that deserves more research, is do we attenuate certain traditional pollutants, but can we create others? And there are concern about things such as Legionella in some of these wet environments if we have warm, wet water that may be standing. And so again, design is very important. What happens with some of the other microbes? I find in our system, by making it very diverse, organisms such as fecal coliforms are readily attenuated. But we need more studies regarding viruses. What happens with waterborne viruses? Again, as Ian has mentioned, these are very complex biological communities, and we are just scratching the surface to begin to understand what is actually happening to specific entities.
I know there are some experiments. I know that Paul Mankiewicz has done some experiments with wetland plants on roofs. It increases the weight slightly, but he has a soil system that that allows for a continual wet root system, which expands the normal plant palette of what would normally be on a green roof, from the common sedum succulent kind of varieties into reeds, rushes, broader array of plants that more resemble a wetland than actually resemble a sort of a high alpine drought environment.
Yeah, there's a couple of, I think, things that I jump in on that. Based on our looking at the different types of microbes that are recruited by plants, one of the areas of interest that led to that was looking at whether or not certain plants that produce compounds called secondary plant metabolites that look structurally analogous to pollutants are actually promoting specific microbes that would then break down those pollutants. And so these are compounds that are typically aromatic. You can smell them. They impart color. They're sort of the phyto nutrients that people talk about in terms of health-related medicines, of herbal medicines. So we looked at, just an example, there's a chenopodium plant that produces a huge litany of secondary plant metabolites that have all sorts of complicated molecular structures, including these cyclic ring structures that look like PAHs, and to some degree anyway. And then there's another one we looked at that produces, it's the sweet yellow clover. It produces a blood thinning compound, which, it can be a problem for livestock, but it looks very much like naphthalene, which is the simplest two-ringed aromatic hydrocarbon. And so the thought was, well, if this plant produces this compound and it exudes it out through its root environment, then it's recruiting specific microbes that have the enzymatic capabilities of chewing apart these other compounds which are not normally found there. And we did find a pretty positive relationship between the presence of those particular plants and the activity of breaking down these pollutants. And so I think when designing, green roof plant selections, I think that's definitely consideration to have in mind, and in green walls as well, is not to just go with the traditional, 6 sedum mix or whatever that seems to be the industry standard, but to expand out into not only is what's around you in the environment, but some interesting choices in terms of colorful and aromatic odoriferous plants that would produce these complicated compounds.
One of the interesting things I find out about green roofs and living walls now is that there's two ways to design a green roof. Is to say, well, what can the structure of the building hold? How deep can the soil be? And based on that, what kind of plants can be supported in that depth of soil? That's one way to do it. Another way to do it is to say, I've got this array of plants I want to use because they perform a particular function, and I want to create this roof around the plants to be sure the plants, those particular plants do well. And as we start expanding our plant palette, we start to combine those two design processes together. And I find that really exciting, especially when you start talking about the added subject of the conversation that plants have with their soil environment through communicating, encouraging certain kinds of soil biology to develop that then can produce not only better broken down nutrients for the plants and reduce their environmental stress that the plants have, but also help us out with the garbage that we're producing that they can either digest for their own purposes or neutralize or alter so that they're don't leave as much of a footprint. These are new topics. I remember someone was telling me the first time they heard the word phytoremediation was in 1995. Soil biology itself is a relatively new field in terms of examining the microbiology, biochemistry of the soil around the root zones of plants. I just find it a really exciting environment because it's both new and mysterious at the same, new, mysterious, complex over our heads, and I think in another way kind of places us in a more realistic perspective in where our place is in nature, because we're still scratching our heads with all this stuff.
And again, as we try to replicate the natural environments, it's always interesting. Man tries to simplify it, but again, it comes back time and time again. The more complex we make the systems, the better it is. I have on my home, I have several green roofs, including one on about 600 square foot, where I have over 110 different species of plants. And this is an extensive green roof, so it's only a few inches of media, and yet I have everything from a fern garden, a cacti garden, all types of perennials, etc. And one of the ways of doing it is designing, again, these micro habitats. I've included a living wall with it, so I can grow my herbs. I raise, I have grapevines there. I hope to someday produce some wine from my green roof. But again, the key to all of this is complexity, making that habitat as diverse as possible.
I'd like to turn the discussion toward a couple of questions that we might be able to discuss here. One of them, how are phytoremediation technologies being used today in general? Not necessarily on green roofs and living walls, but on brownfield sites. I know both of you have had experience working with brownfield sites. Bob in Northern Europe, with the when the fall of the wall issues there. Ian, I've seen you allude to a number of projects in the United States and North America in your presentations. We might look at not just the building itself and what's on it or on top of it, but the area and landscape around the building. Maybe we could talk about some examples that we've seen, what they were designed to do, how effective they were, that kind of thing. Take it away.
Sure. Guess I'll take it. From my understanding at this point, I think the widest application is groundwater and poplars. So the treatment of contaminated groundwater, shallow contaminated groundwater with poplar trees. And since they're tap-rooted and they love water, they act as biological pumps, and they'll just pull contaminated water out of the ground and using solar energy to destroy chlorinated solvents and potentially other types of compounds in groundwater. That seems to be the most widely accepted and widely applied technology.
The Army Corps of Engineers has a bunch of sites where they used poplars and I believe some other species of plants as well to pull up the toluene that was used in weapons explosion. The TNT is trinitrotoluene. Toluene is a residual that happens with a lot of explosives. So around a lot of these test ranges, they've planted or they've introduced wetlands and poplar trees to target the particular pollutant that's particularly concentrated in those areas.
Mm-hmm.
We had in industry, we had a wide range of industries that we represented, and as a result, we literally had every imaginable type of compound and unfortunately resulting contamination, since some of these production areas dated back to the initial part of the Industrial Revolution. And one of the interesting things, as we began to again more fully understand the extent of subsurface contaminations back in the early 70s, one of the things was plants also were an indicator of contamination. And so especially looking at heavy metals, etc., we got to the point where you could look and see stress vegetation growing in some of these areas where something may have been spilled 30, 40 years prior. So taking from there, those plants that were able to survive in these environments were obviously able to adapt, had microbial communities there that were in the process of attenuating some of these pollutants. But typically what we had to do was a combination of techniques. In most cases, there was not one silver bullet that we were able to use a particular type of phytoremediation or a type of VOC withdrawal system, but rather taking the various types of ammunition available to us and then using that depending on the specific problem. But we did look at using some various types of trees, willows, etc., for doing it. But often, for us, phytoremediation was dealing with contamination that was more limited to the surface area. And Ian, what has been your experience in some of the greater depths using phytoremediation? Is that still a limiting factor?
It is. I mean, there are ways around that to trick plants into doing that. You can actually dig wells and then put a tube down in there and plant a tree, 10 feet below grade, and then it'll start off there. We did have a project in southern Oregon that had relatively deep groundwater for that area anyway, and the poplar trees that were planted there were able to access that groundwater. I think it was about 20, 25 feet down. It took some time. But the stand, once they tapped that groundwater, they acted like a very efficient pump and stopped the progression of this plume of perchloroethylene in that case. But that was also, like you're saying, this wasn't the silver bullet. It was in tandem with some other, a well field around there that was being extracted and pulled upon by mechanical means. Another application that has been getting attention is arsenic removal with the Chinese brake fern. Seems to be looking pretty successful. I haven't had any direct experience with that, although that's a very interesting subject. I just have had some interest in that area because in our region of Vermont here we have naturally heavy metal rich deposit of serpentine soils running up and down parts of the Green Mountains, and the Chinese brake fern, non-native and tropical or semi-tropical species, has relatively limited application outside in this climate. But it just raises the question: are there other plants out there that haven't been looked at that have been naturally adapted to these environments that are toxic? They're natural deposits of heavy metals exist out there anyway, and those ecologies haven't been looked at for application type scenarios. They've been characterized in terms of what grows there, but not necessarily people out there bioprospecting, picking plants from that to then apply to roofs or other cleanup scenarios.
I know within the green roof context, there's been a number of plants that they thought were originally unique to some particular microclimate and climate that would either develop a subspecies or adapt to climates that they previously thought would be completely alien and hostile to them. I remember there's one plant. I remember when 3 Mile Island happened. The spiderwort plant got to be a very popular plant as a diagnostic or a warning plant for radiation. It's sort of like a canary outside the coal mine or something like that. It was interesting to see how plants can be used as a signal for pollution, like Bob suggested, as well as as an engine to remediate pollution. In talking about getting phytoremediation, phytotechnologies into the mainstream, what kind of roadblocks and success stories have you heard about, read about with regard to displacing sort of older, perhaps less efficient, more capital intensive kinds of solutions with phytotechnologies?
Yeah, well, I've worked on that subject a little bit with in Oregon and California and some here in Vermont, but it seems to me that the main obstacle is the mechanism by which a site is deemed worthy to clean up, and that specifically is a transaction. So whenever a property sits for a period of time, an old industrial site or a gas station or something, typically what happens is the former owner goes out of business, and then they fold up shop, and then the thing sits there and it becomes a brownfield at that point. and then it'll sit for decades or years or whatever. And then the point at which someone becomes interested in that property to redevelop it is when it gets triggered into this cleanup mode. And so at that point, you have a buyer, you have a developer on site, and they're ready to go. They're not going to wait 10 years, 5 years, 2 years, 3 growing cycles, whatever, for phytoremediation to happen. And so what you've done is you waited decades, or in the case of, here in the Northeast with the old tanneries and stuff, 100 plus years, for the site sitting there dormant, a risk to everyone around it, and then someone becomes interested in it and they want it done tomorrow. And that's when basically, they pull out all the stops and they get the big loaders and excavators and they dig up the soil and they use petroleum to solve a problem. They're just basically transferring a risk from one place to another, through their action of dealing with it in that way. And so it's a big obstacle to phytoremediation. It seems to be the main roadblock, at least from my perspective, in getting these types of technologies applied wide scale. There's others in there, but that seems to be the big one.
And I also find, so looking again at wastewater treatment, so constructed wetlands have now been used for over 40 years to treat wastewater. There's systems out there such as John Todd's Living Machine, again, very well constructed to take care of pollutants in wastewater, and yet there is a resistance to permit these. I just had an example recently with a system that it took several years of, again, local regulatory authorities looking at this because they are more comfortable with traditional systems. And so it's one of those hurdles to overcome with new technologies and getting people comfortable with them, building up a case history. But our regulatory framework in the United States, for instance, from a wastewater standpoint, operates at the local level. And they're not in communication with one another throughout the country necessarily. And so some of these new technologies are very difficult to have people sign on. And the other thing, again, is often they'll say, well, let's try it, but you need a backup system. And the cost becomes prohibitive. Now you're building 2 systems. So it is difficult when you look at now incorporating green roofs, living walls, other things as functional architecture. There are a number of regulatory hurdles on these that people are concerned about. What if they do not work?
Yeah, I still find that when you're introducing, green roofs have been around for a very long time, since the Irish invented them in, I think, 3500 BC. They've been around so long, and yet I find that public officials will still ask extremely naive questions about them. Do they leak? Things like that. So yeah, I understand that. The other issue too is a fundamental political turf. People involved in plumbing code, health department, water departments all have their own little territories they want to guard. And so if they start losing power or losing funding, the similar issues crop up with research as well. The subjects that get funded are the ones that get researched. They may not be the ones that really need the research, but it's that's an issue too of how to direct effort toward the most efficient discoveries. What do you guys see happening in the future? Let's turn this on a bright side and say in the next maybe 10, 15, 20 years, given what we've learned about phytotechnologies already, what do you see in the future of potential uses? Let's say that the regulators become liberalized and educated on the issue, and funding is available. What do you see happening?
Well, one thing regarding wastewater treatment is wastewater technology is being driven, or the need for it, by the fact that our available drinking water supplies are diminishing. And from a host of reasons, whether it's the drought, global warming issues, intrusion of salt water, pollutants, etc. And consequently, more and more places are going to be forced to look at creative ways of reusing wastewater and turning wastewater into a water resource. So the fact that here we are in the 21st century still using potable water for flushing commodes doesn't make much sense. So I see as a big driver is unfortunately the calamities that, especially in the Southwest, some of these areas are starting to face, that it will drive these types of technologies to be adapted.
It's interesting. One of the things that got me into looking at phytoremediation was realizing that in the arid Southwest, places that can result in a really good cooling load from a green roof or a living wall are places that are shy on water, usually hot, dry places. And where do you get that water if it's not going to come from a potable source? You find it in the gray water area, and that's where you hit the regulations and the dual plumbing systems and all that sort of stuff winds up being a nightmare. But we found out that there's this incredible link between water and like energy as well. So if you're reducing your cooling load, you're reducing your energy, and if you're finding a way to phytoremediate gray water through your green roof, which which has the result of reducing your cooling load, and also results in a water that might be reusable within the building in ways that the initial gray water was not available to be used. And again, our codes with regard to how close to potable water has to be to perform an array of functions. I tell people that you can flush a toilet with motor oil. That's no terrible. It's no, you're not an eco saint because you're flushing a toilet with rainwater or gray water. There's other higher uses that can be used for it.
I think that's what you described there is a big issue, and that it can be extended beyond water. Just in terms of, broadly speaking, our relationship with the environment. We're very a developed society, very industrialized, and so we have this environmental management approach now that relies upon technology, and it's becoming what we're comfortable with. I mean, you described regulators looking at you and asking silly questions about, does it leak and things like that, because they're comfortable with now these engineered approaches to, natural issues like rainfall and erosion and silly things like that are all just dealt with very natural ways. And it seems to me that, as we move forward, what really needs to happen is re-examining that dependency and that default pattern to go towards a technological solution to an environmental relationship issue, and go back to what is the governing relationships in nature and try to mimic those within our own civilizations and our own lifestyles that we can. And I think phytotechnologies, broadly speaking, is a perfect example of that. It's just looking at nature, mimicking what's happening already out there. There are microbes that can break down lignin, one of the most resistant compounds, and why not apply those to some situation that's a toxic compound? And we can apply that to a variety of different ways. But what really needs to happen is to somehow incentivize that transition. And I think one way to do that is it's a little bit of a political issue, but carbon tax. If we were to tax carbon, then all of those things that we rely upon to do these little silly things like clean water and clean soil and manage erosion are become negative from a financial perspective, because we're relying upon petroleum, we're relying upon big, tractors and things like that, or asphalt roof tiles or whatever. And those become taxed, and so it incentivizes that transition. And it seems to me that without that, we're kind of grasping at, kind of the early adopters and relying upon them to say, lead the way and solve everyone's problems.
Yes, in nature there are no waste, and so we really, in our human-made environments, need to look more and more at how we can develop systems that utilize these various things. And one of the very important tools, I think, that we need to develop fuller is life cycle analysis. So in looking at the types of materials we use, too often we are subsidizing it as a society without even realizing. And so as we get better at evaluating the different types of materials that we're using in our homes, in our businesses, I think this again will help to drive so that we can create systems that more better replicate what's being done in nature.
Sure. One of the things I really find stimulating about phytoremediation is that number one, it's adaptable. Plants adapt. The microbiology around root zones adapt to changes. Machines, mechanical filters don't. And they're also not capitally intensive. So you don't have a lot of, again, like Ian alluded to, you don't have a lot of hydrocarbons being burned, fossil fuels being burned to produce a part that goes into a filter mechanism that is then turned on by a pump that uses electricity to deal with phytoremediation. You have a biological process. And I think some of the times we get scared of biological processes because they're opaque to us in so many ways. There's so much we have to learn about them still. We feel more comfortable about constructing a machine that we don't fully understand all the resources that went into it. But at least we have this machine, that we can understand.
Right.
So I think we're at about time for the panel. I think this went really well. We did a really good balance, I think. So here's your last chance for posterity. If you guys have any last words before we're out of time, now's your shot.
But just a quick question for Ian. Ian, are y'all doing anything looking at the microbial communities, trying to delineate specifically those around the rhizosphere?
Yeah, not so much now. I had done some work on that in the past, and actually looking at the rhizoplane, which is just the little surface itself, and what's growing in contact with the root. So you look in some detail with the ribosomal sequencing and things like that.
See, what I think would be interesting is taking some of these man-made environments like green roofs, constructed wetlands, etc., and try to delineate the microbial communities that are there. And there's just so much potential. One of the things is, how does it change? So does a green roof, a 1-year-old green roof, change dramatically compared to a 10, 15-year-old green roof? And what if I start adding gray water to it? How does that start to change the makeup of the microbial community?
Yeah, that would be fascinating.
Well, we find that we've been finding that, not to go off on another topic, another panel, but we found that soils for a green roof are able to sustain a broader array of plants the older they get, assuming that they're healthy, because the microbial communities will adapt, evolve to break down a broader array of nutrients, and that actually can create an adaptive environment so that certain plants can actually live in that environment where previously they weren't able to, simply because of the microbial evolution that has happened within the soil. So we've seen that happen a number of times where, on year 3, the sedums, etc., might still be okay, but by year 5 or 6, grasses are starting to establish very easily. You might even wind up with some herbaceous perennial communities are starting to develop, and so you have a broader array of plants. Not because you're introducing a lot of new fertilizers and new nutrients, but because the soil biology itself is maturing and evolving.
The succession pattern is definitely a natural cycle that happens a lot. It's environment gets disturbed, and then you get colonizing species. They would come in, and what they're doing then is changing the chemistry and the microbiology of the soil, and that allows for the next stage and the next stage and so on. One thought that I've thought about, a connection there with with soil contamination, is if you have a newly an event where a spill occurs and it's a freshly contaminated environment, what it seems to me is a question I'd like to look into further, is whether or not it would make sense to go to an older contaminated site, grab some of that soil, and bring it and seed, so to speak, the soil that was freshly contaminated. So then those microbes that have been working away at that old site now can be colonizing the new site, and you wouldn't have this long lag phase that occurs when you have a newly contaminated site.
Wow, I never thought.
Exactly.
That's great. All right, well, thank you very much, Bob Cameron and Ian Balcom, for a great discussion. I think that we're going to have some materials online that will give references to further further information with regard to phytoremediation. Ian is the editor for the International Journal of Phytoremediation. They have conferences every year. There's a number of free downloadable books you can get on phytoremediation from the EPA. And so thank you very much, and see you all in the biosphere.